The promise had been extracted from Silas Garrison, the way a bad tooth gets pulled painfully, against his better judgment, and leaving a hollow ache where something solid used to be. It was the spring of 1879, and the Wyoming territory was just beginning to thaw from a winter that had killed more cattle than any man in Laramie County cared to count. The mud on the main street of Dunmore was ankle-deep in places, and the wind still carried a blade of cold that cut right through a man's duster, no matter how thick the wool underneath. Silas had ridden into town on his roan gelding, a horse he called Copper for the color of his coat, with nothing more pressing on his mind than a hot meal, a whiskey, and a night in a bed that wasn't frozen ground. He had not expected to find himself sitting at the bedside of a dying man he had never liked, and he had certainly not expected to walk out of that room carrying the weight of someone else's life on his shoulders. The man's name was Calhoun, Rex Calhoun. He ran the Double Cross Ranch, which sat about 14 miles southeast of Dunmore along the fork of the Sweetwater River, and he was a man who had cheated at cards, shorted his cowhands on their wages, and once allowed his fence line to creep a full quarter-mile onto Silas's grazing land without so much as an apology. Silas had sued him in the territorial court and won, but Calhoun had never forgiven him for it, and the feeling between them had calcified over 3 years into something cold and permanent, the way ice forms on the underside of a rock and stays there even when the surface looks clear. Nobody had sent for Silas. He had simply been passing the hotel when Doc Alderman had stepped out onto the boardwalk with his bag in his hand and a grim expression on his face, and when their eyes met the doctor had said quietly, "He is asking for you." Silas had almost kept walking. He told himself later that he did not know why he had turned around, except that maybe there is something in a man that cannot walk past a deathbed, even when the dying man is someone he cannot stand. Calhoun had looked terrible. The fever had been eating him for 2 weeks by then, some lung infection that had started as a cough in January and had grown into something that rattled and gurgled and would not be reasoned with by any medicine the doctor possessed. He was thin in a way that looked wrong on a man who had always been broad and heavy, and his face had the yellow cast of old wax, but his eyes were still sharp. Silas had always respected that about him, even while disliking almost everything else. Rex Calhoun had sharp eyes. "Garrison," Calhoun said, and his voice was barely above a whisper, though it still had the edge of a man who was used to being obeyed. "Sit down." Silas sat. "I am going to die," Calhoun said, with no particular drama, just the flat acknowledgement of a man who dealt in facts. "The doctor has told me as much, and I have believed worse news from less reliable sources." Silas said nothing. He turned his hat over in his hands. "I have a daughter," Calhoun said. "Her name is Stella Quinn. She took her mother's name when her mother passed, and I never much argued it because it suited her better than Calhoun ever would have." He paused to breathe, and the breathing cost him. "She is 23 years old. She has been living in Denver for the past year, learning to be a school teacher. She does not know I am dying." Silas waited. He could feel where this was going the way you can feel a storm coming before you see the clouds. "I have written to her," Calhoun continued. "She will come as soon as the letter reaches her. The Double Cross is hers by right. I have seen to the legal arrangement through Alderman, who is also my notary. But the ranch is not in good shape, and there are men in this county who will try to take it from her the moment they know she is a woman alone on that land." He said the name then. Harlan Greer. Silas knew the name. Everyone in Laramie County knew the name. Greer was a land speculator who had been buying up struggling ranches at pennies on the dollar for the past several years, and he was not above using pressure to make a ranch struggle in the first place. 3 families had sold to him under circumstances that no one could quite call honest, but no one could quite call criminal either, and Greer was smart enough to keep it that way. "I need someone to be there when she arrives," Calhoun said. "Someone who knows the land and the law and is not afraid of Harlan Greer." "There are plenty of men in this county," Silas said. "There are plenty of men in this county who owe Greer money or fear his temper or both," Calhoun said. You are not one of them. Silas turned his hat over again. The brim was worn smooth in a wide arc from the number of times he had done exactly this when he was thinking. I do not like you, Calhoun, he said. It was said without heat, just as honest as breathing. I am aware, Calhoun said. I do not particularly like you either, but I am not asking you because I like you. I am asking you because you are the most stubborn, most principled, most infuriating man in this territory, and those are exactly the qualities my daughter is going to need. He stopped to breathe again, and this time the effort took longer. I cannot pay you. The ranch is mortgaged nearly to the timbers. But I can give you something else. My word in writing, witnessed by aldermen, that I misrepresented the survey when I moved that fence line and that you were entirely in the right and that I knew it. Silas looked at him. That is not worth much to me now, he said. The court already ruled in my favor. No, Calhoun said, but it might be worth something to you in other ways, to know that a man admitted it, even a man you do not respect. There was a silence between them that held more weight than either man was entirely comfortable with. Silas made the promise. He did not want to. He made it anyway, the way a man does when he is more afraid of who he will become if he refuses than he is of the inconvenience of saying yes. He stood up from the chair, settled his hat on his head, and said, I will look after her. Calhoun closed his eyes, and it was the most peaceful Silas had ever seen the man look. Rex Calhoun died 3 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon when the sky was a hard pale blue and the first prairie flowers were pushing up through the mud on the south-facing slopes. Silas heard the news from the liveryman and said very little about it. He rode out to his own spread, the Garrison quarter circle, which sat north of the Sweetwater and was everything the double cross was not: modest, solvent, and tended with the kind of careful attention that came from a man who loved his land without drama. He had been running the quarter circle alone for 2 years, since his foreman had moved east to be near family, and he had gotten used to the solitude. He was 31 years old. He thought of himself as a man who was done with complications. He gave himself exactly 1 day of that thinking before he saddled Copper and rode the 14 miles southeast to the Double Cross. The ranch looked like neglect made physical. The main house was a 2-story structure that had once been fine, with a wide porch and a stone chimney, but the porch railing had been left to rot, and 2 of the outbuilding roofs had caved under the winter snow and not been repaired. There were 3 remaining cowhands, men named Fowler, Briggs, and a young Mexican vaquero everyone called Tomas, who did not seem entirely certain whether they still had jobs. Silas introduced himself, explained enough, and told them to stay on until further notice, at which point Fowler and Briggs looked relieved and Tomas simply nodded with the calm of a man who had seen a great deal of change in his life and had learned not to be rattled by it. The letter Calhoun had sent to Denver would take perhaps a week to arrive, and the journey back would take another week at least, assuming Stella Quinn could arrange passage quickly. Silas settled himself into the ranch as a caretaker, sleeping in the foreman's room off the kitchen rather than the main bedroom, which felt like too much of an intrusion. He set Fowler and Briggs to work on the most urgent repairs and rode the fence lines himself to understand what he was dealing with. It was worse than he had expected. 3 sections of fence near the eastern boundary had been pushed down, not broken down as a steer would do it, but pushed in a way that suggested deliberate human pressure. The push sections were exactly the ones that bordered Harlan Greer's holdings. Silas mended them himself, working in the cold morning air with wire and pliers, and the particular stubborn satisfaction of a man who knows he is being tested and intends to refuse the test. He found the well had been partially blocked with rock, not collapsed, but deliberately fouled. He spent an afternoon clearing it. He did not say anything to the hands about what he suspected. He simply worked and watched and kept his rifle in the scabbard on Copper at all times. Stella Quinn arrived on a Wednesday morning, 11 days after Calhoun had died. Silas saw the wagon coming up the road from Dunmore before he could see the person in it, just a dark shape against the bright spring sky, kicking up a light dust on the road that had dried some in the warm days since the thaw. He was on the porch when she climbed down from the driver's seat, and he realized with a start that she had driven herself the whole 14 miles from town rather than asking anyone to collect her. He noted that. It told him something. She was not what he had expected, though he could not have said precisely what he had expected. She was slim and straight, with dark hair that was pinned up but coming slightly loose from the journey, and she wore a traveling dress the color of stormy water, dusty from the road. Her face was, he found himself searching for the right word and settling on composed, though composed in the way that a person gets when they are holding something difficult very carefully so it does not spill. Her eyes were gray, and they took in the ranch yard with a single sweeping look that told him she already knew it was worse than she had hoped. She turned those gray eyes on him, and there was nothing soft about them in that first moment. They were measuring and direct, and entirely without the uncertainty he might have expected from a woman arriving at a dead man's ranch in a territory she had left a year ago. "You are Silas Garrison," she said. It was not a question. "I am," he said. "Doc Alderman told me you had taken over the care of the property. He said you made a promise to my father." She paused. "I would like to understand the nature of that promise before we go any further." Silas found that he appreciated this. He came down off the porch steps and stood at a respectful distance. "Your father asked me to be here when you arrived, and to help ensure that no one interfered with your taking possession of the property. That is the whole of it. And what do you expect in return?" "Nothing," he said. "The promise was made for its own sake." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind picked up her hair a little and she did not reach to fix it. "My father was not a man who did anything for its own sake," she said. "And from what I understand, he was not a man you had any reason to do favors for." "That is accurate," Silas said. "Then why?" He thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because he asked me on his deathbed," he said finally, "and I could not say no to that, even if I had wanted to." Something shifted in her expression. Not softened exactly, but shifted, the way a closed window shows a different quality of light when a cloud moves. "Well," she said, "I thank you for the honesty, Mr. Garrison. I suppose that is a place to start." She turned toward the house and he walked with her, and that was how it began. The first week was entirely practical and entirely guarded on both sides. Stella was not unfriendly, but she was not open either. She moved through the ranch house with a systematic efficiency, cataloging what needed to be done, reviewing the account books, which were in a state that made her go very quiet for a long time, and meeting with Fowler, Briggs, and Tomas in the kitchen with her sleeves rolled up and a cup of coffee cooling at her elbow. She asked intelligent questions about the cattle, the water supply, and the state of the eastern fence, and she listened to the answers without interrupting. Silas watched her do all of this and said very little unless asked. He understood that she was establishing herself as the owner of this place, and that she did not need him performing her authority for her. He respected it. He also noticed privately that she was doing it at a cost to herself that she was not letting anyone see. She would take the account books into the back study and close the door, and once, passing in the hallway, he heard a single sharp exhale that was not quite a cry but was not quite nothing either. When she came out, her face was as composed as it always was. He pretended he had not heard. On the fourth evening, he was sitting on the front porch after supper when she came out and sat in the other chair without ceremony. They watched the sunset together for a while in silence, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. The sky over the Sweetwater Valley was doing something extraordinary, as it often did, turning colors that had no names in any language Silas knew. "The mortgage is significant," she said without preamble. "I know," he said. "I looked at the books my first day here with your father's foreman. The foreman left." "He did, before I arrived." She let out a breath. "The cattle count is down from what it should be. Fowler told me about the fence sections on the eastern boundary. I mended them." She turned to look at him. "More than once, 3 times in 11 days, he said. "They go down again within 2 days each time." There was a hard quiet. "Harlan Greer," she said. "I have no proof," he said carefully, "but the fence does not fall down on its own." "No," she said, "it does not." She looked back at the sunset. "I know about Greer. My father wrote to me about him last summer. He seemed to think he could handle it." "Your father was a capable man," Silas said, choosing the words with care. "My father was also proud to a fault and would not ask for help until his last breath," she said, and there was something in her voice that was both frustrated and grieving at once, which is a particular kind of complicated that only family can produce. "That appears to be when he finally asked for some." Silas said nothing. He turned his hat over in his hands. "I will not lose this ranch," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it had the quality of iron that has been hammered flat and allowed to cool. "I did not leave Denver, and I did not travel 11 days, and I did not bury my father to stand here and watch Harlan Greer take what belongs to me." "I know," Silas said. "You do not have to stay," she said. "You have your own spread. You have kept the promise. I would not fault you for riding back to it." He looked at the sunset. He thought about his own land, quiet and waiting. He thought about the fence going down again on the eastern boundary. He thought about her face when she came out of the study after closing the books. "The fence will go down again tomorrow," he said. "I will mend it again." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Mr. Garrison." "Silas," he said. She nodded once. "Stella," she said. They stayed on the porch until the last color left the sky, and then each went inside, and neither mentioned it the next morning, but something small and durable had been established between them, like a nail driven cleanly into good wood. The thing about living in close proximity to a person while engaged in hard physical and organizational work is that there is very little room for performance. You see people as they actually are. Silas began to see Stella Quinn more clearly with every passing day, and the picture that emerged was a great deal more complex and a great deal more compelling than the word daughter had suggested. She rose before first light. He learned this because he was also up before first light, and he would find her in the kitchen with the stove already burning, coffee already made, with Calhoun's account books or the land survey papers spread across the table in the lamplight. She was trying to understand the full extent of what she had inherited, and the process was not pleasant, but she pursued it with the tenacity of a woman who had decided that ignorance was more dangerous than bad news. She had been training to teach school, and it showed not in any soft or decorative way, but in the way her mind worked, organized, methodical, never satisfied with half an answer. She caught the discrepancy in the cattle records on her 5th day, a difference between the spring count Fowler remembered and the figure in the book that was too large to be explained by winter losses alone. "Someone was selling cattle off the books," she told Silas that evening. "I believe it was happening for at least 2 years. Possibly longer." "The former foreman," Silas said. "Or someone with access to the books," she said. "I cannot prove it was him, but I can see the shape of it in the numbers." Silas thought about it. "It does not matter for recovery purposes," he said. "Knowing the real count matters. Can you work with the actual numbers?" She spread the papers out between them at the kitchen table and showed him her calculations. It was the first time they had sat down together over something specific and worked at it side by side, and Silas found that she was remarkably easy to think with. She did not talk for the sake of talking. She was direct, and she acknowledged when she did not know something, which he found unusual and admirable in about equal measure. They talked about the cattle market, about the spring drive to Cheyenne that would need to happen in 6 weeks if she was going to service any part of the mortgage before the bank's patience ran out. They talked about whether the current 3 hands were enough for a drive of that size, and whether they could afford to take on another 2 riders for the season. At some point the lamp burned low and they both looked up and realized the kitchen had gotten very dark around them and that it was well past 9 at night, which in ranch terms was nearly the small hours. She began gathering up the papers with a small embarrassed motion. "I am sorry. I lost track of the time." "So did I," he said. He was surprised to realize he meant it. She looked up at him across the table, and for a moment the light was low enough and they were close enough that he could see the tiredness in her face, and also the way she carried it with a kind of dignity that struck him as beautiful in a way he had not let himself think the word beautiful about anything that was not a landscape for quite some time. He looked away first. He stood up and trimmed the lamp and told her to sleep well, and he went down the hall to the foreman's room and lay on the narrow bed staring at the ceiling for a good deal longer than he usually needed to before sleep came. Harlan Greer arrived the following week. He came with two men who were not quite cowboys and not quite gunfighters, but occupied the ambiguous territory between, the way Greer occupied the territory between businessman and predator. He was a large man with a pale mustache, and the kind of easy smile that a person uses when they want to seem friendly, but have never actually practiced the emotion behind it. He arrived in a hired carriage rather than on horseback, which Silas read as deliberate. It was meant to say that he was a man of means, not a working man, that the power arrangement was established before anyone spoke. Stella met him on the porch, and Silas stood beside her, which he had not discussed with her beforehand but which she did not appear to object to. Tomas was visible near the barn, not dramatically so, but visible. Fowler was on the far side of the yard. Silas had arranged none of this, but he appreciated that the hands had arranged it themselves. Greer got out of the carriage and came to the bottom of the porch steps and took off his hat with the broad gesture of a man performing graciousness. "Miss Quinn," he said, "my deepest condolences on the loss of your father. Rex was a complicated man, but he was a part of this county's character, and he will be missed." "Thank you," Stella said. Her voice was even and pleasant and gave away nothing at all. "Mr. Greer, I presume. You've heard of me," he said, with a smile that was meant to be charming. "Of course," she said. "You are the man who has been pushing down my eastern fence." The smile thinned fractionally and then recovered. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Miss Quinn. It is an old fence. The winter was hard." "The fence has been mended 3 times in 2 weeks," Stella said. "The wire cuts on the posts are consistent with deliberate removal, not weather damage. I had Mr. Garrison examine them." She paused. "I believe you know Mr. Garrison." Greer's pale eyes moved to Silas and held there for a moment. Whatever he read in Silas's face was not encouraging to him, because the smile dropped entirely for a second before being replaced with something colder. "Garrison," he said. "Greer," Silas said. "I had heard you were here," Greer said. "I wasn't aware you had business with the Double Cross." "Miss Quinn is my nearest neighbor," Silas said pleasantly. "I am a neighborly man." Greer looked between them. He recalibrated visibly, the way a man does when the calculation he walked in with no longer holds. "I came to make Miss Quinn an offer," he said. He turned back to Stella with the smile reinstated. "I know the ranch is carrying a heavy mortgage. I know the cattle count has been diminished by a difficult winter. I am prepared to offer you a fair price and relieve you of a burden that might otherwise consume what should be the best years of your life." "How kind," Stella said. "I'm afraid the ranch is not for sale." "You might want to think on that," Greer said, and his voice dropped half a register, which was the first open sign of the pressure underneath the pleasantness. "I have thought on it," Stella said. "The answer is no, Mr. Greer. The ranch belongs to my family, and I intend to keep it. I also intend to report the fence damage to the county sheriff, which I have been so far reluctant to do in hopes that the matter would resolve itself. It appears that hope was premature." There was a silence. One of Greer's men shifted his weight near the carriage, and Silas watched him with the still attention of a man who has already decided exactly what he will do and is simply waiting for the necessity. But Greer was smart enough. He knew the difference between a situation he controlled and one he did not. And 3 cowhands plus Silas Garrison plus a woman who was clearly not going to be frightened into signing anything added up to a situation he did not control. He put his hat back on his head. "I'll leave the offer open," he said, as if he were doing them a favor. "The conditions of the market change fast out here. You may find you see things differently in a few months. I may find I see a great many things differently." Stella said agreeably. "Good day, Mr. Greer." Greer went back to his carriage and left without further ceremony. Silas watched the carriage all the way to the road before he turned. Stella had sat down in the porch chair, as if her legs had independently decided they had stood straight long enough, and she was pressing her hands together in her lap in the way a person does when they are releasing tension after the fact. "You did that well," Silas said. "I was terrified," she said. "I know," he said. "You did it well anyway." She looked up at him, and there was something open in her expression for the first time, a crack in the composed surface that let something real show through. It was only there for a moment, and then she gathered herself and stood up straight again. But in that moment, Silas felt something in his chest do a thing he had not prepared himself for. It was not dramatically large. It was just a recognition, a warmth that had no good practical reason to be there, but was not going to be argued out of existing by any amount of practicality. He went to mend the fence. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that Silas had not expected to find comfortable, and found that he did anyway. He rode between his own ranch and the Double Cross, spending 2 days at the quarter circle to keep his own affairs in order and the other 5 at the Double Cross, which was a division of his time he had not precisely explained to himself, but which kept happening. The spring drive was organized. Silas contributed 3 of his own horses to the remuda and rode on the drive himself alongside Fowler, Briggs, Tomas, and 2 additional riders they had taken on from Dunmore. Stella stayed at the ranch, which made practical sense, though Silas found himself less comfortable with the arrangement than he would have liked to admit. He left Copper in the corral for her use, which she raised an eyebrow at. "You are giving me your horse," she said. "In case you need to ride quickly," he said. "And what will you ride?" "I have 3 other horses on the drive," he said. "Copper trusts you." She looked at the roan gelding, who was watching her with the calm, slightly superior expression that horses get when they know they are being discussed. "He barely knows me," she said. "He knows you well enough," Silas said. "You have been feeding him carrots every morning for 2 weeks." She had the grace to look slightly caught out. "He is a very good horse," she said. "He is," Silas said. "Take care of him." "I will take care of him," she said. Then more quietly, "Silas, come back with a good number." "I will do my best," he said. "I know," she said. She met his eyes for a moment with a directness that he felt somewhere behind his ribs. Then she stepped back and he rode out. The drive to Cheyenne took 8 days, and the price they got was not extraordinary, but it was not bad either, good enough. When added to a small reserve Stella had brought from Denver, and a modest loan extended by the Territorial Bank on the strength of the cattle as collateral, to make a meaningful payment on the mortgage, and to fund the repairs and resupply that would see the Double Cross through to a summer that might actually be profitable. Silas sent a telegraph ahead from Cheyenne so that Stella would know the numbers before he arrived. He rode back faster than he had ridden out, which he noticed but did not examine closely. She met him at the gate, which she had not done before, and for a moment when he rode up and she was standing there with her hand on the gate post, and the late afternoon sun behind her turning everything that warm gold color that the Wyoming spring does in the evenings, Silas felt something shift definitively inside him that he knew was not going to shift back. She was smiling. It was the first time he had seen her smile without any reservation in it, and it was a remarkable smile, not because it was the most beautiful smile he had ever seen, though it was lovely, but because it was entirely genuine, and genuine things were what Silas Garrison had always valued most in the world. $730 applied to the mortgage, she said, as he swung down from his horse. The bank extended the payment schedule. "We have time." "We have time," he agreed. She extended her hand to shake his, and he took it, and they shook hands like business partners, but neither of them let go of the other's hand quite as quickly as a business handshake required. And when they both noticed this at the same moment, there was a beat of something charged and quiet and slightly complicated. Then Stella laughed, a short surprised sound, and let go, and turned toward the house saying she had kept supper warm, and Silas stood at the gate for a second with a feeling he had not had in years, which was the feeling of a man who is very specifically happy to be exactly where he is. He went inside for supper. May gave way to June, and June was generous in the way that Wyoming June sometimes is: warm days and cool nights, and the grass coming in thick and green along the Sweetwater, and the cattle filling out and getting their good summer condition. Silas was spending less and less time at the quarter circle and more time at the double cross, and the justification for this kept expanding to accommodate the reality of it, the way water finds the shape of whatever container it is in. He told himself there was still the threat of Greer, which was true. He told himself the double cross needed the extra management attention, which was also true. He did not tell himself the other thing, because he was a man who was cautious with himself about things that could not be retrieved once spoken. But the evenings on the porch were becoming what he looked forward to more than anything else in the day. They had fallen into the habit of sitting together after supper while the light went out of the sky and talking about nothing in particular. The cattle, the weather, what Stella had read in the Cheyenne paper that the Dunmore mail rider brought once a week, what Silas knew about the neighboring ranches and the history of the valley. She was curious about everything and asked questions without self-consciousness and listened to the answers with real attention, and he found himself talking more than he normally did with anyone, which surprised him. She told him about Denver, about the normal school where she had been training and the woman who ran it, a formidable widow from Ohio named Mrs. Hackett, who believed education was the engine of civilization and ran her classrooms accordingly. Stella spoke of it with affection and something that might have been longing. "Do you miss it?" Silas asked one evening when she had gone quieter than usual after telling him about one of her students, a girl of 12 who had shown a remarkable aptitude for mathematics. Stella looked at the dark line of the hills. "I miss the work," she said. "I was good at it. I liked the children." She paused. "But the ranch is mine. It is what my mother grew up on before she married my father. She loved it. I always knew it would come back to me if it survived long enough." "And you intend to make it survive," he said. "I intend to make it thrive," she said, and there was that iron in her voice again, steady and certain. Then she looked at him sideways, with help, of course. He looked back at her. The moon was up, and the light from it was silver and kind on her face, and she was watching him with those direct gray eyes that never gave quarter, and he knew that the careful, practical arrangement he had been calling this thing between them was not accurate anymore, and had not been for some time. "Stella," he said, and his voice came out differently than he had intended, lower and without any of the practical distance he usually kept. "Yes," she said, as if she had been waiting for him to arrive at this particular moment for quite some time. "I am not here because of the promise anymore," he said. "I want you to know that." She was quiet for a moment. The night birds were calling from the river. "I know," she said. "I have known for a while. I am not certain what to do about it," he said, with the honesty that was his only real expertise. She turned toward him in her chair and folded her hands in her lap and looked at him steadily. "You could tell me what you are thinking," she said. "That would be a place to start." He took a breath. He was 31 years old, and he had faced down winter storms and fence disputes, and a charging bull, and the cold calculation of men like Harlan Greer, and sitting on this porch trying to speak plainly about what was happening in his chest was the most difficult thing he had done in recent memory. "I think about you," he said. "I think about you considerably more than I think about anything that is practical or sensible. I think about whether you are sleeping enough and whether you are eating enough, and whether Greer has sent any men near the eastern fence while I was at the quarter circle. I think about the way you looked when the drive numbers came through." He stopped. "I am aware that is not a very elegant confession." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across the space between the chairs and put her hand over his where it rested on the chair arm, and the warmth of her hand on his was so unexpectedly absolute that he stopped breathing for a second. "I think about you too," she said, "in equally inelegant ways. I notice when you are gone. I notice when you come back." She paused. "I was not planning on this. I came here to save a ranch, not to—" She did not quite finish the sentence. "I know," he said. "But here we are," she said. "Here we are," he agreed. He turned his hand over so their palms were together, and she did not pull back, and they sat like that in the moonlight for a long time without saying anything more, which was its own kind of language and a very sufficient one. The next morning nothing was explicitly different except that everything was explicitly different. He brought her coffee before she could get up to make it herself, which made her look at him over the rim of the cup with those gray eyes that did complicated things to his composure. She looked at the survey papers with him at the kitchen table, and her shoulder was warm against his, and neither of them moved away. Tomas noticed it within approximately 4 minutes. Silas was fairly sure, because the young vaquero had a remarkably attentive face, but Tomas kept his observations to himself with a dignity that Silas appreciated. The summer deepened. Silas and Stella fell into a partnership that was equal parts business and tenderness, and both parts felt as natural as breathing to both of them, which was remarkable given how neither of them had planned for any of it. He rode the fence lines, and she managed the books, and between them they organized the double cross into something that was, if not yet profitable, at least clearly alive and pointing toward profitability. The eastern fence stopped being pulled down in June, which they both noticed without saying anything specific about it. Greer had apparently recalculated his odds and found them insufficient. One Sunday in July, they rode out to the north pasture together, not for any particular work purpose, just because the day was fine and the grass was tall, and Stella had said at breakfast that she had not ridden for pleasure since she arrived, and Silas had immediately offered to ride with her. They rode at an easy pace along the river, and Copper, who she had been riding regularly and who had formed an attachment to her that Silas privately found both amusing and deeply sympathetic, was on his best behavior, which was saying something because Copper had opinions. They stopped at a wide bend in the Sweetwater where the bank was flat, and there was a cottonwood that had been growing there for longer than any living person could account for, its roots going down into the river sand in a complicated tangle that held the bank in place against the spring floods. The water was clear, and the light was on it in pieces. Stella got down from Copper and stood at the edge of the bank and looked at the water, and Silas tied both horses to a low branch and stood beside her. "My mother used to bring me here," she said, "when I was small. She said this tree was ancient and that the river talked to it at night and told it all the news of the mountains." He looked at the cottonwood. "Your mother sounds like she was a person worth knowing," he said. "She was the best person I ever knew," Stella said, simply and without performance. "She died when I was 15. After that my father and I were—" She paused. "We were not well suited to each other's grief. He went inward and I went forward, and the distance between those two directions got very wide very fast." Silas thought about the man on the deathbed, the sharp eyes, the flat acknowledgement of dying. "He loved you," he said, "in his way." "I know," she said. "It just was not a way I could reach very easily." She picked up a flat stone and skipped it across the water with a practiced flick of her wrist that sent it jumping 4 times before it sank. "He asked you to look after me," she said. That was love, even if it was sideways and came through a man he didn't particularly like. "He told me I was the most stubborn, most principled, most infuriating man in the territory," Silas said. "He said those were exactly the qualities you would need." She turned to look at him. "He said that." "He did." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He was not wrong." And the way she said it was not quite a joke and not quite a declaration, but landed somewhere perfect between the two, and Silas felt his heart do something warm and uncomplicated. He reached out and tucked a strand of her hair back that the wind had pulled loose. His fingers barely touched her face, and then he let his hand fall, but she caught it, turned it, looked at his palm with her head down and her dark hair loose around her face. "You have very capable hands," she said, which was not the most romantic thing that had ever been said in the history of human affection, but was so entirely like her that he found it completely perfect. "Stella," he said. She looked up. They were very close, and the river was going past, and the cottonwood was doing its patient, ancient thing above them, and he kissed her. It was not a hasty or uncertain kiss. It was the kiss of a man who has made up his mind completely and is confident in the making, and she leaned into it with a certainty that matched his own, her hand still holding his, the stone-flat ground of the bank beneath them and the whole wide Wyoming sky above. When they separated, she looked at him with those gray eyes that he now found as necessary as water. "I think," she said with careful deliberateness, "that you should ask me a question." He understood her perfectly. "Not yet," he said with a smile that he did not show people often, "but soon." She nodded once as if they had settled a business arrangement, which they had in the most important sense. They rode home in the long evening light, and supper was good, and the porch was lovely, and Silas lay in the foreman's room that night thinking about what soon meant, and found that it meant very soon. The trouble with Greer came back differently in August, and it came back more seriously. It started with Fowler. He came to Silas on a Monday morning with his hat in his hands, and a look on his face that was somewhere between embarrassed and frightened, and he said that he had been approached the previous Saturday in Dunmore by a man in Greer's employ who had offered him a sum of money to report on the state of the double-cross finances and the timing of any mortgage payments. Fowler said he had not taken the money. He said he had come directly to Silas when he got back to the ranch, but that he had waited until Monday because he had not known how to start the conversation. Silas thanked him. He told him he had done right. He told no one else about the conversation and then thought about it carefully for the rest of the day. He discussed it with Stella that evening, fully and without softening any of it, because that was what she needed and what she had a right to. She sat with it. She thought with her hands flat on the table, which was something she did when she was processing, a habit he had come to know. "He is going to try to buy the mortgage," she said. "If the bank sells it to him, he becomes our creditor. He can manufacture a default and take the land legally." Silas had arrived at the same conclusion. "We need to make the next payment before he can move," he said. "And we need to talk to the bank manager about the terms. The summer count was better than the spring count," she said. "If we sell a portion of the herd now rather than waiting for the fall market, the price will be lower," he said. "The price will be lower than we would like and higher than losing the ranch," she said, with a decisive precision that he admired enormously. "I can supplement from the quarter circle accounts," he said. She looked at him. "Silas, it is a loan," he said, "between neighbors. Recorded properly. I am not giving you anything. I am investing in a viable enterprise." She looked at him for a long time. He knew she was fighting between her independence, which was fierce and well-earned, and the practical reality, which was what it was. "Recorded properly," she said finally. "Properly and legally," he said. She nodded. "Then yes, and thank you." They rode into Dunmore together the next day, both on horseback, Stella on Copper and Silas on a steady bay he called Fletcher. They spoke to the bank manager, a careful man named Orinoco Hayes, who wore spectacles and kept meticulous records, and who was deeply unimpressed by Harlan Greer's money when the alternative was a client who was clearly solvent and improving. Hayes confirmed that the mortgage had not been approached for purchase by any third party, but that under territorial banking law it was a theoretical possibility if the loan went into default. He agreed to notate the account with specific conditions that would require 30 days written notice before any sale of the debt instrument could proceed. They also stopped at the sheriff's office. Silas had drafted a careful written account of the fence incidents, and Stella presented it formally. The sheriff, a practical man named Doolin who had been in the county long enough to know exactly what Harlan Greer was, and had been waiting for someone to give him something he could act on, took the document with visible satisfaction and said he would be paying Mr. Greer a social call in the near future. They rode home side by side in the long August afternoon, and somewhere on the road between Dunmore and the Sweetwater Fork, Silas reached across the space between the horses and took Stella's hand where it rested on her knee, and she turned her palm up to hold his. And they rode like that for quite a while without saying anything, because everything had already been said in the ways that counted. That evening after supper, with the summer dark settling warm around the ranch and the first stars beginning to show, Silas stood up from the porch chair and walked down the steps to the yard and turned around so he was looking up at her where she sat. He had been turning words over in his mind since July, and he had not found better ones, so he used the ones he had. "Stella," he said, "I made a promise to a man I did not like to look after a woman I did not know. I have kept the promise. And somewhere between keeping it and standing here right now, I have lost every piece of indifference I ever had about you or your life or your well-being or your future." He took a breath. "I would like to ask you to share it with me, your future. And I would like to share mine with you, if you are willing." She looked down at him from the porch with those gray eyes that were very bright in the starlight. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she said. "I am asking you to marry me," he said. She stood up from the chair and came down the steps and stood before him in the yard. She was close enough that he could see the very specific expression on her face, which was made of tenderness and certainty and a kind of radiant calm that was the most beautiful thing he had ever looked at in his life. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." He took her face in his hands and kissed her in the dark of the ranch yard with the stars above the Sweetwater Valley and the horses moving quietly in the corral and the whole quiet breathing life of the place around them. And it was not like any promise he had ever made, because it was entirely and completely chosen, every part of it. They were married 6 weeks later, in October of 1879, in the little church in Dunmore that had been built 2 years previous and still smelled of new pine. The ceremony was conducted by a circuit preacher named Harlow, who had an impressive beard and a warm manner, and who seemed genuinely delighted by the business of marrying people, which was, he said, the best part of his circuit by a considerable margin. Stella wore a dress that had been her mother's, altered by the dressmaker in Dunmore to fit her, ivory cotton with small pearl buttons that ran from the collar to the waist. She had her hair pinned up with a pair of tortoiseshell combs that had also been her mother's, and when she came down the aisle of that small pine church, she looked at Silas with her gray eyes calm and sure, and Silas felt the specific and absolute certainty of a man who is exactly where he has been heading his whole life without knowing it. Doc Alderman was there. Orinoco Hayes was there. Tomas and Fowler and Briggs were there. Tomas in a clean white shirt that he had clearly pressed with great care, his dark eyes warm and smiling. A handful of neighboring ranch families filled the rest of the pews, because people in a county that small take their happiness where they find it and do not let an occasion pass uncelebrated. Harlan Greer was not there. 2 weeks before the wedding, Sheriff Doolan had presented him with documented evidence of deliberate property interference, the fence incidents, and suggested very clearly that the cost of continuing to make trouble for the double cross would significantly outweigh any potential benefit. Greer had gone quiet after that, the way a man goes quiet when he is doing his arithmetic and coming up with unfavorable results. He had not bothered them since. They said their vows in that pine church with the autumn light coming through the windows in long golden bars, and the preacher pronounced them married, and Silas kissed his wife with a tenderness that made the doc produce a handkerchief, and several of the neighboring ranch wives exchange very satisfied looks. The reception was held in the churchyard because the afternoon was fine, and the leaves were turning on the cottonwoods and aspens, and someone had a fiddle, and there was good food and sufficient whiskey, and an atmosphere of genuine celebration that lasted until well after the sun went down. On the ride home to the Double Cross, which was home now, jointly and entirely, the legal transfer having been completed at Alderman's office with the quarter circle merged into the Double Cross holdings for a combined and healthier operation. Stella sat beside Silas on the wagon seat, close enough that her shoulder was against his arm, her head eventually coming to rest against his shoulder as the horses plodded the familiar road under the October stars. "I am happy," she said into the dark as if she was still slightly surprised by the fact. "So am I," he said. He put his arm around her shoulders and held her close, and the wagon rolled home through the Wyoming night, and it was very good. The winter of 1879 to 1880 was mild by Wyoming standards, which was a mercy, and they spent it well. The house had been repaired through the summer and autumn, the porch railing replaced, the outbuilding roofs rebuilt, the kitchen enlarged because Stella had pointed out that if they were going to run a combined operation, they would need a proper table that could seat the hands in bad weather. Silas had built the table extension himself over 3 evenings in November, and Stella had oiled the wood and set it with the mismatched collection of pottery and tin that was the double-cross's inheritance, and they had eaten at it together every evening since. They were learning each other in the close way that winter demands, the small preferences and habits and tender irritabilities that make up the private language of a shared life. Silas was constitutionally orderly and had strong feelings about where tools should be kept. Stella was organized in bursts, capable of profound system and capable also of profound creative chaos in the middle of a project. The account spread across every available surface until she had worked through the problem, at which point everything would be tidied away in a way that was somehow more precisely organized than when she had started. These tendencies negotiated with each other and came to reasonable terms. She was reading in the evenings from a box of books she had brought from Denver, novels and histories, and a treatise on agriculture that she found more interesting than Silas had expected any novel to be, and she read aloud sometimes, which he had not known he would like but found that he did. Her voice was good for it, clear and expressive, and she did not hurry when it was not time to hurry. He taught her things about the land that he had learned over years of working it, how to read the grass for drainage, how to judge a horse's health by the condition of its hooves and the brightness of its eye, how to mend wire fence with cold hands in a wind, which was a skill that required a specific kind of patience he had always thought was native to him alone, and found she had in equal measure. In February she told him she was expecting a baby. She told him in the kitchen in the morning while the coffee was on the stove, just directly and without ceremony, which was entirely like her, and he put down his cup and looked at her with a feeling so large and uncomplicated that it took him a moment to find the words for it. "Are you well?" he asked, which was not perhaps the most romantic first response, but was, he thought, the most important question. "I am very well," she said, and she was smiling that genuine smile that still did the same thing to his heart it had always done. He crossed the kitchen and held her very carefully, which she tolerated for about 3 seconds before pushing back slightly and informing him she was not made of glass. He agreed that she was not. He was, he realized, incandescently happy. Doc Alderman confirmed the pregnancy in March and said that Stella was in good health and that everything appeared entirely normal, and that she should continue the work she was doing, which was, as usual, everything with only modest adjustments for the later months. The spring of 1880 arrived like an apology for the previous year's hardship, warmer earlier, the grass coming in thick, the cattle looking well through the combination of good winter feed that Silas and Stella had arranged the previous autumn and the milder temperatures. The double cross was solvent for the first time in at least 5 years, by Stella's careful reading of the historical accounts. The mortgage payment was made in March without difficulty. There was a modest surplus. Tomas had stayed through the winter and proved himself more valuable with every month, an excellent horseman, a reliable and steady hand, and also a man of genuine kindness, who brought a quality of warm good-heartedness to the daily life of the ranch that Silas found he appreciated enormously. They had found, over the winter, a friendship that surprised neither of them greatly and both of them considerably. The spring cattle work was busy and demanding, and Stella, now visibly expecting, managed the books and the supply arrangements from the ranch house with undiminished efficiency, while also finding it necessary to gently, but firmly inform everyone who suggested she rest that she was perfectly capable of deciding for herself when she needed to rest. In June, when the cottonwoods along the Sweetwater were in their full summer green, and the days were long and generous, Stella went into labor on a Thursday morning, and Doc Alderman arrived from Dunmore in time. And on the afternoon of that Thursday, a boy was born who was healthy and loud, and possessed from the very first moment of a quantity of opinion about his circumstances. Silas sat in the kitchen with his hat in his hands, and a feeling he could not organize into anything coherent. And when Alderman opened the bedroom door and told him he could come in, he went very quietly to the bedside and looked at Stella, who was tired in the complete and specific way of a woman who has just done the hardest work there is, and at the small person who was wrapped in blankets and held against her. She looked up at him, and she looked like herself, just briefly and beautifully stripped of every layer that was not absolutely essential. "Come and look at him," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son. The baby was red-faced and had his eyes closed and had Stella's nose, he thought, or at least the beginning of it. "He needs a name," Stella said. "We agreed on Thomas," Silas said. They had talked about it at some length in the winter evenings. "Thomas Garrison," she said, trying it. "Then Thomas Calhoun Garrison." He looked at her. "I know," she said quietly. "I know how you felt about him. I know what he was, but he sent for you. Even at the end, he did one right thing, and this," she looked down at the baby and then back up at Silas, "is what came of it." Silas thought about Rex Calhoun on the deathbed, with the sharp eyes and the flat honesty. "You are the most stubborn, most principled, most infuriating man in this territory. Those are exactly the qualities my daughter is going to need." "Thomas Calhoun Garrison," he said. It fit. The year that followed was the best year of Silas's life, which he knew with the complete certainty of a man who has had enough experience to be able to recognize the thing clearly. The ranch prospered. The combined operation of the quarter-circle grazing land and the double crosses cattle and water rights proved stronger than either had been separately, which was a fact that Stella had worked out on paper before the first winter, and that the subsequent reality fully endorsed. Tom was an energetic and interested baby who became an energetic and interested toddler who had his mother's gray eyes and his father's stubbornness, and a personality that seemed to be entirely his own, which was the most interesting kind. He was fascinated by the horses with an intensity that started before he could walk and progressed steadily, so that by the time he was 2 years old he was being carried around the corral by his father on a daily basis, examining everything Copper did with the focused attention of a person conducting research. Stella had begun teaching again, informally at first, the children of the neighboring ranch families who came to her on Saturday mornings in the main room of the Double Cross, where she had set up a proper blackboard along one wall and had sent to Denver for the books she needed. There were 7 children in the first year and 11 in the second, and the quality of instruction they received was by every observable measure excellent. By 1880, she had written to the Territorial Education Board requesting formal recognition of the school, and the response had been favorable. Silas rode Copper every morning. The horse was getting older but carried himself with the dignified authority of a horse who knows his own worth and expects it to be acknowledged. Stella still fed him carrots every morning without fail, and Copper received them with the regal calm of someone accepting a tribute that is merely appropriate. Harlan Greer had sold his Wyoming holdings in the spring of 1880 and moved to Colorado, which the county received as news with collective relief and some satisfaction. Sheriff Doolin had stayed in his office for another 2 years and then retired to a small house in Dunmore, where he could be found most afternoons on his porch with a pipe and a good-tempered expression, which was the retirement he had always wanted. Fowler had married the daughter of a sheep rancher from the North Valley in 1881, which had been regarded in the county as a mildly scandalous intermarriage of cattle and sheep interests, but which proved to be a perfectly good marriage by all subsequent indications. Briggs had moved on to a ranch in Colorado the previous autumn, amicably and with good references. Tomas had stayed, and was now effectively the foreman of the double-cross operation, a title that Stella had given him formally in writing with the associated wage and responsibility, and which he had accepted with the same calm dignity with which he accepted most things, though his eyes had been warm in the way that told you clearly how much it meant. In the autumn of 1882, Stella told Silas at the kitchen table. She always told him things at the kitchen table which he found endearing and constant, that they were expecting again. "Are you well?" he asked, just as he had the first time. She gave him the look she reserved for repetitions. "I am very well," she said. "As I was the first time." "It bears asking each time," he said. "It does," she said, and her tone said that she actually agreed and appreciated it, which was the nature of their arguments, generally brief, direct, and usually followed by agreement. This time it was a girl, born in May of 1883 during a rainstorm that was warm and steady, and had been going all day in a way that seemed appropriate, the world making its preparations along with everyone else. She arrived in the early evening, and Silas sat in the kitchen with Tom, who was nearly 3 and knew that something significant was happening, and expressed this by refusing to sleep and asking very precise questions about where babies came from that Silas answered honestly, but at a developmental level he judged appropriate. When Alderman came out and said they could go in, Tom walked very solemnly ahead of his father to the bedroom and stood at the edge of the bed with his gray eyes, Stella's eyes, very wide and serious. "That is the baby," he said, with the authoritative certainty of someone stating a fact. "That is the baby," Stella confirmed, tired and smiling. "Her name is Eleanor." "What do you think?" Tom considered the baby for a long moment. Eleanor was sleeping, which Tom regarded with some suspicion, as he rarely slept himself. "She is very small," he said. "She will get bigger," Stella said. "You did." Tom appeared to find this plausible and nodded. Then he looked up at Silas and said, "Papa, she is very small." "I know," Silas said. He lifted Tom up onto the bed beside Stella, carefully, and sat on the edge himself, and the 4 of them were there together in the lamplight, while the rain came steady and kind on the roof of the ranch house that had been repaired and tended and lived in with such deliberate care. Eleanor Rose Garrison, they named her. For Stella's mother, who had loved the cottonwood tree by the Sweetwater and told a small girl stories about what the river said to it at night. The summers at the Double Cross in those years had a quality that Silas sometimes found himself simply stopping to appreciate, which was not a thing he had done often before he met Stella Quinn. He would be on his horse in the north pasture, or mending a fence on the western line, or doing something entirely practical, and he would look up at the wide Wyoming sky and feel the specific warmth of a man whose life has turned out to contain more than he had originally expected it to, and it would stop him for just a moment. He was not a demonstrative man by nature, but he was not indifferent to his own happiness. He had lost the capacity for that indifference somewhere on the road between a deathbed in a Dunmore hotel and a woman with gray eyes and a practical manner, and a heart that was as big and as sturdy as the land she had refused to relinquish. He told her this one evening in the summer of 1883, when Eleanor was a few months old and sleeping in the house, and Tom was in bed, and the porch was quiet, and the stars were what they always were over the Sweetwater Valley, which was extraordinary. He was not a man of speeches. He said it in the way he said most things, directly, without ornament. "I did not expect my life to be like this," he said. She looked at him from her chair. "Like what?" she said, which was Stella. She never let a vague statement go uninvestigated. "Good," he said. "I did not expect it to be this good." She looked at him for a moment. Then she moved from her chair to his, which was not entirely practical given the limited space but which they managed, her settling against him with his arm around her and her head on his shoulder, looking at the stars. "Neither did I," she said. "I came out here to save a ranch." "And did you?" he asked. "We did," she said, "and more." He tightened his arm around her. The night was warm and close, and full of the sounds of a working place at rest, the horses in the corral, the night birds, the far-off sound of the Sweetwater doing its patient and permanent work. The cottonwood tree by the river, which Stella had taken both children to see by now, speaking to her daughter of her own mother in the same words her mother had used, was telling the river its news in whatever language trees use. A few years on, in 1885, when Tom was 5 and Alina was 2, and the school had been formally recognized by the territory, and was now meeting 4 days a week in a proper small building that had been constructed on the Double Cross property, with a donation from the Territorial Education Board, and a great deal of labor from the families whose children attended. Silas and Stella had a third child, a boy they named James William Garrison, who arrived in the spring with the snowmelt, and who from the very first proved to have his father's calm disposition and his mother's absolute certainty about his own opinions, which was a combination that augured very well. The school was the thing that Stella spoke of with the clearest unguarded pride, which Silas loved about her because it was an honest pride, not a prideful pride, but the real kind that comes from having done something genuinely good. 15 children, most of them from families who would have had no formal education available to them otherwise, were learning to read and cipher and understand the world more precisely, and Stella taught them with the same methodical, patient, demanding intelligence that she brought to everything. Several of the parents had commented, to Silas and to others, that they had noticed a difference in how their children talked about things, a new precision, a new willingness to question and investigate. It was the kind of comment that made something in his chest ache warmly. He had built her the schoolhouse with his own hands and the hands of neighbors, raising the walls on a Saturday in October 1884 with 12 men, and sufficient organization that the structure was enclosed before nightfall, and the roof was finished within the week. Stella had walked through it the day before the first school session and touched the walls and the window frames with a careful, deliberate attention that he had come to recognize as her expression of deep feeling, and then she had turned around and said, "It is very good, Silas," with a directness that was more than the words said. He had taken her hand. They had stood in the empty schoolhouse together in the October afternoon light. "Your mother would have been very proud of you," he said. She had not said anything for a moment. Then she had said, "I think she would have been proud of this." Her hand tightened in his. All of this. By 1887, the Double Cross was one of the most reliably operated ranches in Laramie County. The mortgage had been fully retired in 1885, an occasion that Stella had marked by making a quiet notation in the account book, and then making dinner and not mentioning it through the meal until Tom, who was 7 by then and deeply interested in numbers, had asked her what the notation meant, and she had explained it to him in a way that was a perfect small lesson in the relationship between debt and freedom and the patient work of time. And Silas had sat at the table listening to her teach their son and had thought, "This is what happiness looks like when it has grown up properly." Not the burst of it, the warm shock of falling in love with someone you had not expected, though that had been extraordinary, but the long, steady, accumulated rightness of a life built with care and shared with honesty. Tom had developed into a serious and thoughtful boy with a talent for horses that had fulfilled its early promise entirely. He had a way with them that combined gentleness and authority in the proportion that horses respond to. And Copper, now quite old and more carried than ridden, had appointed Tom as his personal attendant with a regal certainty that suggested the horse had made the selection independently and expected it to be respected. Alina was fire in miniature, opinionated and vivid, and as intellectually voracious as her mother, currently reading at a level several years ahead of her age and agitating to be allowed to attend her mother's school classes, even though she was technically still 2 years too young. James was steady and sunny, and spent most of his days close to his father, following Silas around the ranch with the particular devotion of a youngest child who has identified the correct person to apprentice himself to. On a clear autumn evening in 1887, with the golden light lying long across the pastures and the smell of the dry grass and the cool coming in off the mountains, Silas and Stella sat on the porch together in the way they had sat together since the very beginning. The chairs were the same chairs. The view was the same view. The world behind them, the house full of children and warmth, the ranch alive and solvent and tended, the school building visible from the porch across the yard, was the world they had built together, one season at a time, one decision at a time, one early morning and one long evening at a time. Stella had her hands folded in her lap, which was not the tension-releasing gesture it had once been, but was simply the comfortable habit of a woman who thinks well when her hands are quiet. Her hair had a few threads of gray in it now, which Silas found beautiful in a way he had tried once to articulate, and she had refused to let him continue on the grounds that she was the same age she had always been, and did not require commentary on the subject. He had agreed to this arrangement. She turned and looked at him. Those gray eyes, still direct, still without quarter, still the most honest eyes he had ever looked into. "Do you remember," she said, "what you told me once about why you made the promise?" "I told you I could not say no to a deathbed," he said. "Yes," she said, "and I thought that was a very strange reason to change the direction of two people's lives." "It was a strange reason," he agreed. "But here we are," she said. The words were the same words she had said years ago on a dark porch with the moonlight on the cottonwoods, and they carried all that time in them and were more true now than they had been then, if such a thing was possible. "Here we are," he said. He reached across and took her hand, turning his palm up, and she laid her hand in his as she always had, as she had done since the beginning, as he expected they would do for as long as there were years in which to do it. Inside the house, one of the children called out James, probably, with that carrying voice that could navigate walls without difficulty, and they both looked at the door and then back at each other. "We should go in," Stella said, without moving. "We should," he said, without moving. The stars were beginning to come out above the Sweetwater Valley. The cottonwoods were gold in the last light. Copper, old and magnificent, moved in the corral with a slow serenity that was its own kind of contentment. A promise had been made in a room where a dying man lay, extracted under circumstances that were not comfortable, given by a man who had not wanted to give it. The woman on the other end of that promise had been a stranger. Everything had been as unlikely as a single flat stone skipping 4 times across moving water. And yet here they were, on the porch of a house that was theirs, listening to their children inside it, the ranch alive and tended around them, and the Wyoming night coming on in its ancient and indifferent beauty, which was not indifferent to them at all, or felt that way, the way that nature, when you love someone in the middle of it, seems to arrange itself in acknowledgement. Silas Garrison had made a promise to a man he did not like. He had looked after a woman he did not know. He had kept the promise. And somewhere in the keeping of it, he had lost every particle of indifference he had ever possessed, and had not once, not for a single moment of any of the years since, wished it back. He squeezed her hand. She squeezed his. They went inside to their children and their life, and the door of the ranch house closed warmly behind them, and the stars came out fully over the Sweetwater Valley, and it was very good.